Fortunately, we're not too far. Other examples of good bots are utility bots like status cake and pingdom, service uptime monitoring bots. They provide a nice utility for us. These are automated tools that we see in our server logs and we don't worry about. They don't cause any harm. Archive.org is another great example of an automated crawler bot. Goes across the internet, takes snapshots of sites and saves them to its archive, and then it's very handy. You can go back in time and see what a website used to look like years ago. Some bad bots that we are probably very familiar with, spam bots, those things that come in, try to submit trash to our contact forms, message boards, create junk everywhere that we have to deal with. There's also like fuzz bots. If you ever look in your web server logs and you have like a Drupal site and you see requests to the WordPress login endpoints and other files that just don't match your application, those are fuzzy vulnerability scanners. They're just like brute force scripts. They have a big catalog of known malicious attacks, and they'll just run all these different attempts against websites just looking for a vulnerability in a way in. We see those from time to time. And then a combination of all these different little bots into a big swarm, botnets. That's something that we've been pretty familiar with over the past decade or two. Caused a lot of problems. Usually they're used for some malicious, nefarious purpose. We'll see now that a lot of the effects of crawlers from AI bots kind of have the same result as what we've experienced with these botnet swarms over the past few years. So we're using some of the same detection and mitigation strategies that we've learned in the past. I will mention, it is possible for good bots to be disrupted. There was a time when Google's SEO bot, Bing bots were crawling sites too aggressively. They would get caught in different endpoints that would cause loops, and there were times when they would unintentionally crash sites, and those crawlers have learned and dialed in and improved their crawling abilities, and so a lot of what we've learned from them we can apply going forward. Okay. What we're seeing now over the past year or two is a new source for automated traffic to our websites. There is clearly a moonshot in the industry from all these different AI startup companies to gather content and data from all sorts of different high-value, trusted sources to train their models, to train their large language models, to train their products. And it makes sense that state, federal government sites are a clear target for these types of crawl events. The models really rely on high quality, well-structured, organized content, and state and federal government sites are the source of truth. So it is no surprise that these types of sites are being targeted by these crawlers. So what we are seeing in our web server logs are a combination of user agents and spoofed user agents from these startup companies. They look sometimes like any other bot crawler. We often look at the user agent strings and we'll see something that sticks out to us. We'll see, GPT bot, Claude bot. There are a lot of bots that do identify themselves and we're able to identify. But we're seeing a lot of examples where they not only don't identify themselves, they intentionally spoof their user agent and their sources of origins to look like normal traffic. And they would normally totally go undetected if they weren't crawling so heavily and causing basically outages across sites. That's what's drawing our attention to a lot of this problem. The majority of the problem from some of these startups seem to be a result of growing pains in the people that write these scripts. We suspect that a lot of the noisemakers are starting with scripts and crawling utilities that are not necessarily well formatted, not well structured. They don't take into consideration crawl rate. They don't do any type of intelligent sanitization on the URLs that they crawl. And then that's part of the reason they just come at websites so heavily at such a high rate that a web infrastructure just cannot keep up with that. Another thing that we've noticed is that they will, in addition to spoofing their user agents, we'll notice that a lot of the user agent strengths that look like legitimate web browsers are actually very out of date. We're not entirely sure exactly why this is. I suspect that there are several Chromebooks, desktop TVs, internet-connected devices that have been hacked or compromised that are being leveraged as part of some type of like bot for hire. Because a lot of these origins that use outdated browsers are coming from all different countries across the globe. There's not necessarily just one set or one region or one ISP. It, again, looks like normal traffic. They just have an odd request pattern that I'll identify here in the next slide. So this is what we've been experiencing over the past year or two that's really led us to look into what sources of these traffic in an attempt to get to the bottom of this. I think I don't necessarily have to explain this too much, but the impact of this is just crushing our sites. So this has been pretty well discussed on sites that host a lot of high-value content. We have gotten a lot of different reports from our clients, just slow performance. I mean, all the symptoms of a website that just gets more traffic than the infrastructure is designed to handle. The effect is essentially an unintended denial of service attack. This is what really gets messy. The crawlers will go in and at some point they'll crawl the site and then they'll sit on the list of URLs from the sitemap. Instead of just crawling it all at one time and then being done, moving on, they tend to come in at some point, take a snapshot, grab the sitemap, and parse it. Share the long list of URLs across dozens, hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands of unique IP addresses across the world, and then come back and perform their crawl event in a distributed, across all these different IP addresses. So when we look at our logs, again, it's confusing because if we try to parse by individual IP addresses that are going to the same search page that's being requested over and over again, we're noticing that often there's each IP address is only making 1, 2, 3 unique requests. And this, again, looks like normal web browser traffic and makes it very challenging to write firewall rules to target these types of requests. But the result is still something that we have to deal with. So, the website's running slow. That means that users can't access the site or it's slow for them. Content editors have a miserable experience because they're logged into the Drupal backend. They get a less cached experience. And that's often the primary motivation for them to just report and open support tickets with us. Hey, the site feels slow today. And all of the other, we've noticed that our analytics can be polluted. Google Analytics is supposed to filter out what it identifies as bot traffic, but since a lot of these crawlers are spoofing their user agents to look like legitimate browsers, we've really been unable to trust the analytics that we get from our Google dashboards. So again, it's just messing a lot of our trusted data up. These crawl events can last for hours. They can last for days. The crawl events seem to get started easily, and there's not a good mechanism for whoever initiates them to stop them. So once they start, we kind of have to deal with it rather than just wait it out. Sometimes they'll start early morning, overnight. It's really an unpredictable pattern. We haven't noticed any patterns. Another annoying consequence of all this traffic is the hosting provider just goes through its billing overage. So there's a cap for its billing rate that we set for our clients, based on expected normal traffic historically, and all this additional request traffic just blows right through that. So some clients, in the case of our clients, we have provisions, and our hosting providers have been very understanding, and nobody's gotten a bill, but it has created a lot of frustrating service requests and support requests for them. And there are a lot of people across the internet, much smaller sites, much smaller agencies, much smaller products, that don't have such a high level of service. They get legitimate bills, surprised at the end of the month, for hosting overages, and it just has been nothing but a headache for both the person that gets the bill, but also the hosting provider that has to put up with the support requests. Okay, so let's talk about how we have started to try and detect these crawl events, to try and detect what it looks like, whether something is happening, and then make some informed decisions on what to do about it. This is tricky. We used to get, what often happens is, like I mentioned, a stakeholder from a website will just open a support ticket or email us to say the site feels slow. Well, that can mean anything. And sometimes this can be extra troubling for our sites when we build a new site, deploy it, launch it on a new infrastructure that suddenly we have access to, we manage and maintain. We have spent a lot of hours running down rabbit holes, chasing our tails, trying to fine-tune Drupal, thinking that there's some bug, some misconfiguration, some problem, without realizing that there is just too much web traffic coming to the infrastructure. So what used to often happen is we would get reports from users, and then we would go look. Since then, we've developed more automated tools. We always have a service called Status Cake, which is like a service uptime monitoring ping tool. Sometimes that will be able to detect when a site is actually down. Unfortunately, that often is just like only going to respond if the site is actually offline. It won't tell us anything if the site is performing slowly. So we have tools that we can tell us if the site is performing slowly, like New Relic, Blackfire.io, other monitoring tools. They allow us to set rules to capture, like if a transaction time, or the average transaction time is higher than a certain threshold for a certain number of minutes, and then it can send an email or a Slack ping to us to let us know that something suspicious is happening. And we have to fine tune that because we always end up with false positives. But in general, if we see a spike or an alert at 2 or 3 a.m., probably something suspicious, and probably not necessarily everybody getting to their desk at 9 a.m. and visiting the website, and everybody logging and performing action at the same time. After we establish, or after we're alerted that there's some problem, then that's when digging in starts. We have started to really go directly into the web server access logs. This is what I have a snippet of here on the screen. This is impossible to read, I'm sorry. But I wanted to highlight examples of what types of patterns we have noticed most often in our web server logs. This is information that's tough to get from the CDN, it's tough to get from your firewall logs. I shouldn't say it's tough to get, but the way most interfaces are put together, you have to kind of dig in. What you'll see in most CDN and firewall logs is really just the top request to the path. So in this example, this is just the page. This is a search page. It's located at /posts/all-posts. This is what we'll notice. Usually we'll get tipped off on this, and we'll go in and look at the access logs. Web server access logs are historically tough to parse. They have everything, and they often list the entire tree of requests through different IP addresses. And there are tools that make it a little easier to parse web server logs. GoAccess is a popular one. GoAccess is helpful, but it is a little tricky on this particular problem because it will only kind of help identify the actual, depending on how it's configured, how the actual page, or which pages are most requested. It won't necessarily tell you the broad stroke of all your sources of traffic. Again, because these crawlers look so legitimate, and they come from so many sources, so many different IP addresses, and so many different ranges, and so many different countries and continents. But this type of pattern is what we are seeing most often. If anybody looks at this, they might recognize right away, this is a combination of search page requests with a number of different facet filters selected. And to me, this is a sign of not a normal request. In my experience, legitimate users that go to search pages We'll use the keyword search filter, and our Google Analytics tends to back this up based on some of the analysis that we've done. Normal users just go to a search page, they type in a keyword search, and then they might filter one or two facet search filter options to narrow in on their tagging. Or they go to a listing page and they do the opposite. But they tend to only select a few facets. And they certainly don't go onto page 12 after selecting dozens and dozens of different facets. With some exceptions. For the most part, normal traffic does not behave this way. This tends to be a result of a combination of things. I suspect this is a result of a combination of things. One, websites that have far too many facets. This was a thing that years ago we got really interested in as the industry, making our content structured in a way that can be organized with taxonomy, discoverable with facets, and organized nicely. And we have, frankly, Forum One as an agency has spent a lot of time on a lot of our projects to build out well thought out content models, information architecture, and Drupal facets to support this. But it does seem like fewer and fewer legitimate users are going this in depth. And so this tends to be a sign of a pattern of some crawling. I think that some of these crawling tools, these scripts, get mixed up in the different combinations of links that the facets generate. And what happens when dozens, hundreds, thousands of these requests all come in? They're often all new, so they're not cached. The uncached Drupal page is the heaviest thing that can be loaded by a web server, it seems. And there are just too many of them. If there was one or two, if the crawl rate was slower, we probably wouldn't notice this. It would have very little effect because the crawler doesn't care if the response time to the page load time is slow. But this is what happens when hundreds of thousands or more of these requests come in over a burst of time. One other thing that I do have highlighted at the bottom here, I wanted to point out, what I will do is I'm always curious on source IP addresses. This is not a science. I just go and look it up on Whois just to see country of origin, which ISP, and we tend to kind of know the target traffic audience for our websites. For example, pick a state agency like the Virginia DMV. Does the Virginia DMV need to cater to Alibaba in Singapore or just a request from Singapore? Maybe, probably not. In general, it's just another sign that this is not a real person, more or less. Also, I have highlighted here an example of a very outdated Chrome browser. I think right now the latest Chrome version is like 139 or something like that. So just another piece of evidence to help us kind of make an informed decision that this structure of requests, not real. So what do we do about this? Step one, robots.txt. Look, this is tricky because some of these crawlers just straight up ignore this file. There was a time a few years ago where OpenAI, Claudebot, some of these more well-known startups now were really abusing sites, and despite being specifically called out on robots.txt, we're just ignoring them. I mean, robots.txt is not enforced, it's just a recommendation. Since then, in the past, I would say year, it does seem like the larger companies are respecting this file. I did link here to the New York Times robots.txt example. That seems to be a nice, easy, comprehensive list that we have implemented and at least started our default robots.txt from. But the robots.txt file is really not enough. What we have found to be a lot more effective is a web firewall, a CDN, something that prevents traffic from even ever accessing the infrastructure in Drupal. If you have access to a CDN, I love Cloudflare, but there's also Akamai and other services. Those are really your first line of defense. I know that not every agency has access to one for various reasons. Procurement is not the most straightforward. The departments that we have to work with that would control and manage these services. And even if we did have access to these services, interfacing with those departments to get rules in place, not the easiest thing. But that really has been what we have found to really slow down the effects of these crawl events. Cloudflare in particular has really been leading this problem space. I have an example here of some rules that I've written for a client site in Cloudflare under this is its web access firewall. And the nice thing about Cloudflare is rather than just blocking this traffic altogether, which unfortunately would also block legitimate requests from whatever that rule set is, Cloudflare has that JavaScript managed challenge that it uses to try and identify whether the traffic is malicious or automated. And for the most part, real users have no problem bypassing this. There's an open source version of this tool called Anibus. So if you don't have access to Cloudflare, but you do have access to manage your infrastructure, that tool looks promising and might help as well. I don't want this to be an advertisement for Cloudflare, but they have really been useful in mitigating the effects of these automated crawlers. They have been working on their own tools internally. They have their own default rule set that you can turn on with a flip of a switch, and it does block a lot of this automated traffic. Occasionally, there's also, this has the unintended consequence of blocking legitimate, sometimes traffic, so we do have to go in and fine-tune these rules. I don't show some of the whitelisting rules really in this screenshot, I don't think. But like, if you can stop this traffic at the CDN or the firewall, that's step one. Keeping it off of the infrastructure is what needs to happen. If you do not have access to a CDN, what's next? What else do you have in your toolkit? Do you have Varnish? Do you have some other access? Do you have access to the web servers like Nginx or Apache's configuration? That's another option. That is a little more tricky because, again, we can't necessarily just block IPs anymore. We could block countries, regions, subnets. That is certainly better than nothing. But I will say that it has been a bit of a whack-a-mole. It really depends on what's happening on your site and what the turnaround time is. I know that a lot of times we don't necessarily have the ability to manage those rules. We have to open support requests with hosting and communicate with that team. But that is another option that we have. Here's a very low-level, unsophisticated, but sometimes effective way to manage some of this. If you establish that there's certain pages on your site that are being crawled repeatedly and are the source of a lot of these problems, just change the path. Change the path, update your site menu so that real users can still access the pages. If your page that's being requested over and over again is your global site search page, just change the path to site dash. Change it to something else. And then ask your make sure you have something like the Fast 404 module installed so that Drupal doesn't bootstrap a whole page. But we have implemented this a couple of times quickly and effectively in cases where we didn't have a CDN or a firewall, and it was very effective. So in one example, we did that. We changed the path of our search page, and we had our hosting provider that could manage the Varnish rules just implement a block to that page request. Any request to that old path, just drop right away. Keeps it from even getting to Drupal. And you might think, well, if you change the URL path, aren't these crawlers just going to discover the new path? Yeah, totally. For some reason, it has taken them months to do so. So it does buy you some breathing room. It's a very low-tech, unsophisticated technique, but it can be effective. Again, if some of us are just site editors, we don't have access to managing CDNs and firewalls, it is a tool in our toolbox. I have an item up here called honeypot traps. This may be the future of mitigating some of these techniques. This links to Cloudflare's Labyrinth tool. I personally don't have any experience with this, but the future of this may be something along the lines of actually providing honeypots for these crawlers to discover. And if you want to de-incentivize them from even coming to your site to begin with, there are honeypot tools like Cloudflare's Labyrinth that will feed basically fake data and fake content, generated cat facts, things like that, to poison and pollute some of these models. Again, to de-incentivize crawl events. I don't have any personal experience with this, but this is potentially an option for this feature in the future, or for this problem in the future. Okay, we've talked a lot about like network stuff, preventing some of these traffic from even accessing Drupal, but we do still probably need to maintain some response from within Drupal. Oftentimes, like I mentioned, we may not have access to the teams that manage the CDN, the firewall, and the hosting infrastructure. So we as site editors have to do something. We're the ones that have to respond to the client requests. We're the ones that have to, show that we're actually troubleshooting the problem. We want to do our best work to, implement and provide good customer support. This all does start with, again, just making sure Drupal is tuned correctly. In general, your site should always try its best to follow Drupal's best performance practices. Turn on page cache, CSS aggregation, make sure all of your views are caching. If you have a search API, really try and fine tune it. The fewer exposed filters you have, the fewer random combinations of page requests that these crawlers will generate, the fewer facets that you have, the fewer combinations of pages they generate. I will say this is a little bit like crying over spilled milk. If you are having a crawl event that's coming at you, disabling the fastest module is too late, because those requests are still going to be handled. Those web requests with the seemingly random generated parameters are still going to come in, regardless of whether facets module is enabled or not. But do try and just be smart with your search pages. The fewer filters, sort options are theoretically going to limit the amount of random generated crawl pages. I would recommend occasionally just auditing your views just to see and make sure everything is configured correctly. And finally, just another common thing: make sure that your dev modules and any unneeded modules are always uninstalled. Production, caching is enabled, twig debugging, things like that should never be enabled in production. We need the production site to be as hardened as much as possible, and there's tools like config split to really help with that. I want to really shout out my colleague John Brandenburg, who's here today. He has done a lot of work for a number of clients at Forum One to work on this problem. In his situations, some of these clients did not have CDNs, couldn't have CDNs for various reasons, or it was not in the card. So John has developed two really good, simple, straightforward, helpful Drupal modules that site editors can use to address this problem. One is called Bot Blocker. It is a simple UI that allows the content editors just to set a blacklist of user agents. So you can put in whatever bots you want. You could copy and paste, use the same user agents that we put in robots.txt or whatever other user agents that you see. It just does a string match. It also has the ability to set a minimum version for all the different web browsers that come in. With relatively reasonable to assume that, since Chrome and most popular browsers auto-update, we don't need to support very, very old browsers. This is just another simple, straightforward tool that we can have in our tool belt. It works pretty well. If any requests come in and match these patterns, Drupal just does not bootstrap and shows a little message to them. Of course, this is not a long-term solution for not having a CDN or a firewall, but it is something. The second useful module that John has developed is very similar. It's called Facet Bot Blocker. What this does is it helps with the problem that I described a few slides ago. Let me go back and show a few slides ago, where we have web requests that come in and have many facet options selected. Again, this tends to not be something a legitimate user does very often. And John's Facet Bot Blocker module allows you to configure a maximum number of facet parameters that can be requested. And you can set that threshold. So if you think that a reasonable person doesn't select more than 5 different facet values, you can set that threshold at 5 or 6, and then this module will just stop those requests and show a 404 and a message to that user. Now, there's a limitation. If there is a legitimate request from a legitimate user that is navigating through any of the search pages and they select too many facets, they'll see this message as well. But for the most part, this is a very straightforward, helpful module that John has developed. I will add, John will be around. I'm sure he'd love to chat about these modules. If any of you are using them, we'd be excited to hear about your experiences. So it would be cool to see these install counts go up after today. Okay, I've spent quite a bit of time talking about crawlers, how they're bad, how to block them, how to mitigate them, how to prevent them from accessing your website and infrastructure. But we are probably looking at a world where we do want to allow some crawlers to access our content going forward. There is a little bit of research that suggests that those AI overviews that some providers show to users that search either in ChatGPT or in Google have actually driven more clicks through to websites. And it really depends on your agency and your agency's mission. There are times when you may want your authoritative content to be what's used and what's consumed and what's used for training for these models. Again, this all depends on your agency's mission, your client's mission. And so this adds some trickiness to the process, because what do we then have to do? Do we have to decide which crawlers are allowed, which are not allowed? Cloudflare is, again, not to make this an advertisement for Cloudflare, but they do have this crawl budget idea that they are implementing, where there is theoretically a new header that they'll establish, and crawlers are given the ability to pay per crawl. That might be the future of this problem in some cases, but we do have to just think about not necessarily just blocking all these crawlers altogether, and rather just trying to establish which ones are respectful and manage, kind of just put out the fires for the most part. Okay, so that's what I have for you. Some key takeaways that I really want to focus in on. These crawlers are certainly not going away. I mean, it's like the botnet problem from a few years ago. It still exists. It comes from time to time. We have to learn how to recognize this type of traffic, how to know that this traffic is not necessarily, or maybe that our web server, website slowness problems, reports from users. We need to maybe not chase our tails and run down troubles in Drupal, and instead rethink some of our troubleshooting. If a client comes to you and says the website's feeling slow, it used to mean like, oh, we deployed something that was not performant, or maybe the data set has grown so large that this Drupal query that I put together is slow, or did I miss a cache, or did I make a mistake, or did I release a bug that's causing the site to go slow. Trying to get people to rethink and reevaluate this, and just start right at the traffic sources. Understand when your website is performing with healthy traffic, what healthy traffic looks like, what legitimate levels of traffic look like, how much you're budgeted for, and pay attention to when there are spikes so that you can get ahead of this problem. And I'll really just hammer away. If you have access to your web server logs, they are hard to read, but you really should occasionally just dig through and look. Just look what legitimate requests come in, see what your users are doing. You can get this information from Google Analytics, but the truth is in the access logs. Read through those and get a good understanding so that you can be proactive in the future. That way you don't get an unexpected support request and spend hours running down a rabbit hole that wastes your time. So thank you all. If anybody has any questions, I'd love to take them. And again, I will be at the 4-on-1 booth on and off for the rest of the day. So let's see, I see some hands. I will start over here with you, sir.
You had a bullet point that you did elaborate on, implement crawl budgets. Can you speak a little bit more about what that means?
Crawl budgets is...
Could you please repeat the question for the recording?
Yes, thank you. The question was, there was a bullet on this slide, implement crawl budgets. This is a link to Cloudflare's new new, was it crawl purchase rule. I personally have not worked with this. This is just something that maybe is the future of managing this problem. This does rely on, this is entirely a service provided by Cloudflare, so if you're not behind Cloudflare or using Cloudflare, this is not something currently that you can use, but it may be something that in the future is a way to manage this problem, especially if you want to allow, you know, your content to be consumed by some of these training models and used in their tools, but you don't want them to just offload the expense of their crawling onto your hosting budget. So that's what that is. Back there in the middle.
I'm working on a redesign of an open data site, and as you mentioned, that might not be something we want to limit necessarily AI crawlers from accessing. If LLMs are really looking for high quality text content, could one proactive thing we do be to limit just like the available text before you reach a data asset, or does that not matter at all?
So I think the question was, if you're developing a site, does the amount of actual text or copy across the site have any impact on any of the crawl events? And that I don't have an answer for, but I will say that those tend to not contribute to the performance problems that we see. What really does contribute is something configured in Drupal that generates or allows crawlers to generate links that are so random that it unintentionally creates like a DDoS attack. An example is in my slide that shows this web request to a search page with a lot of different facets. So maybe what I would suggest is not necessarily worry about the length or the amount of content, and rather reconsider if you're using a search page that uses facets for filtering. Let's maybe reconsider how many of those you have, how many you're showing on the page, things like that. That seems to have a bigger effect.
Related to that, we were able to mitigate some of this by using the new version of facets to turn our facets into views exposed filters. Right, so then they have to actually submit the form. It's not a bunch of easy links, and it does change the user experience, obviously, from the convenience of facets, but it eliminated, you know, all of that traffic in a way, because the bots won't follow all of that.
That's great to hear. So this suggests that facets 3 allows you to switch to exposed facets, and it reduces the combination of links that crawlers will generate. That's great to hear. We have started to upgrade to facets 3 on a few of our projects, and so that's good to hear that that's having a positive impact. You, sir.
Yeah, awesome talk, by the way. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
So, way back in the beginning of the talk, you mentioned there might be like an initial crawl, and then those URLs can get sent out to lots and lots of different IPs. Those essentially create like a botnet attack almost. Is there, what I'm wondering is, because we just went through this, we had a botnet attack. Now I'm wondering if maybe that was more like AI-based, LLM training-based. Do you know if there's a way to, like, once all of those IP requests start coming in, is there a way, do you know if there's a way to know if that's just not like a standard old DDoS attack from, you know, kind of like an old school DDoS attack versus like a crawl sort of attack that you...
I want to restate this question. I'm trying to think about how to best restate it, but I think it's, is there an easy way or a way to quickly identify if you are experiencing a DDoS attack or a crawl event that's effectively causing a DDoS-like effect?
Yeah. And does it matter?
Does it matter? I don't think that it does. I mean, the effect is the site is slow or unavailable altogether. Is there a way to tell? I would encourage you to look at your web server logs and just see what patterns are coming in. What used to occur years ago, and John has a thought on this that I'll add in here in a second. What used to happen years ago is they were a little tough to see patterns with DDoS requests, just from what I recall seeing. But I have noticed several patterns that are easier to follow with this type of behavior. John, come on up. This is John Brandenburg. John is another one of our technical directors.
Yeah, so to answer the question, can we distinguish between bots crawling search faceted pages versus like an actual genuine DDoS attack. I had an interesting experience when I deployed that bot blocker module that was up on the slide earlier. I had a DDoS attack happening as I was deploying this module, and as soon as I deployed it, it stopped. So the things you might see in an actual DDoS attack are just lots of query parameters of just completely random, unrelated junk that might seem like, oh, maybe this is used in some other app, but not my website, right? The crawling of search facets are like, oh yeah, this is clearly, they just got these links from our search page and they're just crawling it. So that's what I've seen with the difference there. The bot blocker was super effective at stopping that because of blocking any requests from older browser versions, blocking specific user strings. I've done a lot of research in this area, so I've kind of identified some other approaches that I could implement, but I just have not yet with the time. I noticed that a lot of these crawler bots don't accept language headers, but this is a generalization, and so with any generalization, it's not always going to be true. But yeah, the bot blocker module was very effective at actual DDoS attack mitigation, because hosts like Pantheon and Acquia don't count 400 level requests towards your rate limit. So
You're welcome to stay up here. Any other questions? Right in the back.
Are there any downsides, let's say a site has Cloudflare set up to also using your module at the same time, so like someone more on the front end be able to quickly step in and edit versus putting in a ticket and have someone at the back end edit Cloudflare?
No, so I think the question was, is there any downside to using both the CDN, for example, Cloudflare, and either of these bot blocker modules? And no, I think they're perfectly paired together. The scenario you laid out where an administrator can quickly go into the Drupal site and add a rule to block a certain user agent, and then communicate that to whoever the administrator of the Cloudflare account is to adjust the rules is a perfect use case.
I have kind of a flip to the question. Our website has a very convoluted IA, and content is really fractured across the site. So I see these crawlers as an ideal way to actually answer the public's questions in a concise and simple way. Is there a way for us to invite the AI to crawl us during off hours? Obviously, the most of our traffic is, Monday through Friday during the workday. Can we invite them to do what they're doing in the evenings, late at night, so that it's ready to go the following day?
So the question is, if you do want to allow crawlers to come in, is there a way to configure them or request them during off hours and not allow them during on hours? I don't actually know if there's a way to configure any of these crawlers or send them a request. We have done, what I have done for one or two of my projects, is actually manually gone in and disabled the rules during certain hours. I think Cloudflare may have an option to schedule this. I couldn't get it to work if I used it correctly. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
yeah, I mean, I think robots.txt works on traditional crawlers. I would kind of add on to the point that these AI crawlers aren't malicious in the way that maybe a toxic friend is not malicious. They just don't care about your well-being. They're not going to follow any requests you make to them. So I think it's important to establish your own rules and enforce them in a very strong way. Don't crawl my site excessively, and yeah. So
That's a good way to put it. I will add that I think I read a report this week that Perplexia is spoofing some like normal innocent user agent string to try and get past things. So they're just not playing by the rules, unfortunately. So the firewalls have been the best way to just enforce those.
Yeah, not really. If you want a fun read, there's a log war between Cloudflare and Perplexity, where Cloudflare is like, Perplexity's doing it wrong, and Perplexity says Cloudflare's dumb and stupid and stuck in 2020, or stuck in 2005, more accurate.
I'm not surprised to hear that. I mean, Cloudflare really does seem like they're taking this seriously. I'm sure it impacts all of their customer base and everything, and they have a lot of experience mitigating distributed, denial of service attacks over the years. So I'm not surprised if they go too aggressively against some of these startup companies.
Well, it's probably worth pointing. The point Perplexity makes is they're making a distinction between their background crawler and a user-initiated crawler.
Yeah.
And they're saying you can't block our user-initiated crawler because we're trying to help someone solve a problem with your website. And it's just the traffic they would send you anyway. And that's the debate.
I envision a lot of these arguments over the next months and years. Thank you all. Let's call it here. If there's any other questions or anything, please stop by our booth. Thank you again for joining, and thank you, John, for joining us.